Hey, everybody. We're just getting started. I'm here with Susan DeMoss, the executive editor of Lincoln Square Media, for our noon Thursday weekly conversation.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I know we had you on our side of the block last
Yeah.
week, and this is great. It's an all Midwest Rust Belt show since I'm right next door in Michigan.
All right.
Um, so yeah, I've noticed that a lot has been going on in your state this week. So you've been contending with your own kind of Save Act. You called it the
Yeah.
Save Act on
Yeah.
steroids. So that's Senate Bill 153,
Right.
and that's making its way through your legislature. So tell me what's going on there, and are other states doing similar things, or does
Sure.
this have a unique Ohio twist?
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, and this is what I tried to write in his first book, Laboratories of Autocracy. Ohio is a case study. Unfortunately, for us, fortunately for you, Michigan removed itself from study status when you ungerrymandered.
Right.
But we're a case study, but it's a national program. I mean, ALEC is and other organizations are writing these laws elsewhere and bringing them to states like Ohio, and the state reps here, much more representing the right wing than Ohioans themselves, basically bring them forward. And so what we're seeing in states like Ohio and others is sort of the state level equivalent of the SAVE Act. They vary in different ways, but it's the same sort of myth that non-citizens are voting, and so they have to crack down on registration, and all of a sudden we know married women and voters of color and others are disproportionately impacted by that. And as we talked about the hearing the other day, in the last 10 years, there were somewhere, depending on the article I've read, either 6 or 9 indictments for a non-citizen voting out of tens of millions cast. As one witness testified, that actually is 0%. Um,
Hmm.
and even in those cases, it was clear that this was miscommunication. They had been told by the board that they could vote. So there's not, it's all a myth. And the history of voter suppression is very clear. It's always justified on myths. Um,
Right.
and that's what's happening. So this was the first hearing here. We'll keep making noise about it, trying, if in any way, stop it, but also if it can get less bad. And the Ohio variant is not just sort of this citizen verification thing, which we know will disproportionately impact Ohio citizens of certain groups, again, like married women. But it's also, you remember about 2 years ago, August, they also tried to make it much harder for us to do direct democracy, go to the
Right.
ballot to change. They're trying to add a whole lot to of both sort of threats and rules to how you collect signatures to try and stop that. So there's another one. If you go to Ohio in the final weeks of the election, there's only one early vote location per county. In
Right.
our large urban counties, the blocks go literally around. They're hours long. We have
Hmm.
lines around blocks. Um, One alleviation of that problem was drop boxes. This bill would ban drop boxes from even existing.
Okay.
Right now, there's one per county, which is also a problem, but they would get rid of all of them. So it's just, it's what you expect. It's what's being cooked up by right wing think tanks. It has nothing to do with the situation in Ohio where we've had clean elections. Non citizens have not been voting. But we can talk about it because I wrote about it. The interesting thing about the other day, it was the other thing I witnessed before I testified against this bill, which I know you guys saw.
Yeah, and so I know, like, the Heritage Foundation, which is an extremely conservative think tank, they've been trying to find examples of voter fraud for years, and they've barely come up with any. And so the new twist, the Trumpian twist, has been, oh, it's all the illegal immigrants who are voting, and that's why we lost in 2020, but we didn't lose, and getting back to that argument.
Yeah.
Um, I I think that, one of the challenges in opposing these bills is that um, I think it's really obvious for those of us who, deal with numbers and, policy. We're like, well, you came up with the number of cases that I can count on my one hand. This is not an issue, you know. Meanwhile, we have millions of people who don't have enough to eat. Let's deal with
Right.
real issues. But Republicans are really good at taking those few examples, like the death of Lake and Riley. I mean, everybody knows her name. Meanwhile, nobody knows the names of all the school children who are murdered every year in school shootings, which
Mm,
are far more frequent. And
right.
so how do we really message against this? Because they've done a good job at telling us, yes, immigrants, they're scary, they're taking everything, they're voting. They want to blow up these very few examples.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people think it is a problem. How do we break through that? And it's got to be with more than just, hey, look at the facts.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a hard question because they are good at it. Then they have a whole echo chamber around it. I mean, the facts here, in some cases, we like we did the other day. This hearing, we use their own words against them. I mean, literally, the Attorney General of Ohio said this isn't even an issue here. I mean, the numbers.
Mhm.
But just like you mentioned, the Heritage Foundation, for years, the Ohio Secretary of State has been pushing as hard as he can a narrative of non-citizens voting, and he's pushed all these cases to largely Republican prosecutors and a Republican Attorney General, and it's those prosecutors and attorney general who came back and said, there only were 9 cases. And
Right.
even those were a problem. I think that one of the things we have to do is also show that the stuff they're doing inconveniences everybody.
Hmm.
And that's the part that gets lost. If there was a survey done a couple of years ago in Ohio. Hey, would you like to have additional drop boxes to vote here? By the way, those of you in bluer states, you have drop boxes down the street in Denver, like
Oh
they're all
yeah.
over.
Right.
Michigan I know has them, and here you had one per county, and apparently now that's too many. That's actually something that most people, whatever their party, or most people just not that political, think is ridiculous. Like,
Hmm.
why do I have to drive half an hour, get out of my car, wait in line, waste a part of my day, even worse, ride a bus for an hour?
Right.
And so I think that at some point we've got to translate. If you don't like government bureaucracy wasting your time, then you should hate what they're doing around drop boxes. Again, why should my wife have to go hunt down old documents, show up at a board of elections to prove that she's a voter when she's been voting all this time, when her husband doesn't have to do that? I mean, there's
Right.
something wrong with that. So I think it's not sort of the 30,000-foot democracy argument, which a lot of us always talk about. It's also, why is government making my life so much more difficult? And in the end, I've heard through the grapevine to crack down on 6 people in 10 years. So I mean, my
Right.
hope is that helps some, but obviously when they're willing to lie about all of it, and they have an echo chamber and they repeat, it is harder. um and that's why one reason, voter ID, they've succeeded in having that be popular. But I think the registration citizenship ones are so problematic for almost entirely citizens of America, that it is problematic for them if married women figure out they're being treated differently than their husbands, for example.
Right. And, inconveniencing people to vote, I mean, that's going to disproportionately affect people in rural areas. And we've
Yes.
seen Trump has had incredible success with those voters. But,
Yeah.
for us in Michigan, we have the Upper Peninsula, where, houses might be 40 minutes apart from each other. And
Right.
so if, you can't get to a drop box, you might be driving an hour to, go vote. And
Yeah.
I'm sure in Ohio, you have, many places like that as well. And so I think these things sound popular until you realize, wait, this affects me. I thought it was
Correct.
just supposed to be the
Yeah.
immigrants or the bad people, but no, it affects me because I happen to get married and take my husband's name,
Right. And
which
it
was
doesn't
something I
affect
never
the
thought of.
immigrants because they haven't been voting. I mean, it's just a myth.
Right.
So you have literally hundreds of thousands or more of Ohioans, let's say married women, who are now going to have to potentially spend money or vote provisionally because they didn't hear about this. And all
Hmm.
of a sudden now they're scrambling back within 4 days of election to prove they're even a citizen. And because non-citizens were voting first place, the only people affected are Ohio voters, like
Right.
legitimate Ohio voters who voted the same way for years.
Yeah. And I mean, just if you want to get into that issue specifically, Republican women are going to be more likely to have taken their husbands' names.
Yeah.
And so it even disproportionately affects Trump's voters.
Yeah. Yeah.
So all these unintended consequences, as you're trying to demonize one group.
Yeah.
And so you wrote that they dropped this bill right before Memorial Day. And so what does the timing of that tell you about their motivation?
Yeah, they announced a hearing on a Friday for a Tuesday hearing of opposition, and you had to get your written testimony in by 2 p.m. on Monday, Memorial Day, or you didn't get to speak. The president of the League of Women Voters did not get to speak.
Uh,
The other one is that was the final days of the final work to conclude the primary we just had. So elections officials themselves, who across partisan lines are against this bill because they know it's bad, they couldn't be there
right.
to say this is what we do. And both Republican and Democratic elections officials are saying this is a bad bill, unnecessary, will make the process of running elections, verifying voters more problematic. This was timed in a way that they couldn't be there. My hope is they get a second bite of the apple, because my hope is their voices might correct some of the worst parts of this.
Right. And I mean, we've seen just all of these bills, especially since 2020, trying to clamp down on voting in so many different ways. And they've obviously been very successful in red states. But across the country, it's been a trend, and it's model legislation. We see this all over. But I think when you actually talk with elections officials, by and large, whether they're Democrat or Republican, a lot of these bills just make their jobs so much harder. And, these are people who are not paid very much.
Yeah.
If you go and you want to be your township clerk, and I'll say this, my daughter is my township clerk. And so this is what she does for a living. Right now, she's in the middle of getting ballots ready for an August election.
Yeah.
And, they're just trying to do their jobs and help people.
Yeah.
And this didn't used to be such a battle. And
Yeah.
I feel for all of these, county clerks, especially, and township clerks, city clerks, especially, these Republican clerks in 2020 that just got slammed with threats because,
Yeah.
they were suddenly caught in the crossfire because, maybe Trump didn't get enough votes, where they were at, and it had to be a conspiracy. So,
Yeah.
we're really these bills, really try and rip apart communities too. And
Yeah.
that's one of those consequences I don't think we spend a lot of time thinking about.
Yeah. Well, here in Ohio, the Secretary of State, who's a real piece of work, used to
Yes.
claim to be a moderate. He literally took credit early in 23 in front of all those elections officials. And by the way, Maxine, yeah, we're talking about a bill that's in Ohio right now, but it's kind of our local equivalent of SAVE Act. But these are happening all over the country and federally. Someone just pointed out. But our Secretary of State went in front of, and I used to go to this as a party chair, the Conference of Elections Officials, and he took credit for having gotten rid of special elections in August because they were such a pain for elections officials. But 3 months later, when they were trying to stop the abortion referendum in November,
Right.
he spearheaded having a special election on the exact August he claimed to have gotten rid of it. And so, literally, the entire year, the Ohio elections officials of both parties had to get up and down, preparing for a big, what turned out a big special, that a big November. And so, when he needed to have his political agenda run over not only what was good for elections officials, which was not having massive issues on the ballot in August, but the thing that he had claimed credit for in front of them because he knows it, he literally changed his mind. Clearly, they violated the very law they passed, and
Hmm.
did it. and could have cared less what those elections officials thought. So yeah, all 23 the Ohio elections officials were working tirelessly because the Republican State House and Secretary of State were trying to jam things through and basically put things over on the voters. But they
Right.
just don't care, and the fact that he took credit for it means he knows what a pain that was, and when it was convenient for him, he tried to act like he got rid of it.
Right. So many times we see people, now if they don't like it, they just change the rules.
Yeah,
Republicans, are really good at finding out, how to game the system, whether it's gerrymandering or, all of these voting restrictions. Um, and, the rest of us pay the price. We've seen in Michigan just a huge difference in our elections when we had the kind of the twofer in 2018, a real
right,
expansion of voting rights and having a citizen redistricting commission pass.
totally.
And if it weren't for those, we could well be on the path to becoming the next Ohio. Um,
You're in my the good news is when I wrote Laboratories of Autocracy, you had one of the worst gerrymanders in the
we did.
teens, and you clawed your way out of it. And sadly, for those of us from Ohio, we were really close. We had two
Hmm.
referenda pass like yours did. They were pretty good, not perfect. We flipped the Ohio Supreme Court, but then they just started breaking the law here,
Right.
and they got away with breaking the law 2 years. They changed the rules of how we elect courts. Carolina has really defied the Constitution the change that we made. So we were very. It's painful to Michigan, Wisconsin. You guys got yourselves out. Like we have two fewer laboratories of autocracy in this country, Pennsylvania too. But those of us on the other end are. It's getting worse, to be honest. That election in August of 23 I mentioned clearly violated the law of Ohio. They had an election that clearly was in violation of Ohio statute that said you cannot have an election in August of this sort. They just did it, and our broken Supreme Court said they could do it. But we are stuck in some of these states in total lawless territory.
Yes. And it's interesting because, a lot of the business community in Michigan and the Republicans have long held up your governor as like, oh, yeah, Mike DeWine, he's a moderate, this is what we need. And yet every time I read about Ohio, it's Mike DeWine just going along with the right wing on everything.
He really has. I mean, my sense is still on some of the these things he knows better, but he's a very good case study of once you start, and this is true of universities and media and law firms. Once you start caving, you never
Hmm.
stop. And
Yeah.
at key moments, again, Mike DeWine is, I think, in his late 70s. He's never going to have another election. Even after that was clear, and his second term was in hand, he still voted for maps that he knew were unconstitutionally gerrymandered. Then he opposed the effort to end gerrymandering. So there was no political motivation in it for him. You'd think he would actually want less gerrymandering because gerrymandering weakens the governorship in states like
Right.
Ohio. He no longer he doesn't have, his veto doesn't matter anymore thanks to gerrymandering. Even then, he goes along with it. And sounds very harsh, but I think in the long arc of history, when we look back, it was the more moderate people that did the most damage because when they go along with it, their more moderate brand puts a sort of a more nice cover on
Yes.
extremism. And people like Trump and right wingers in the state house, they know this. So Trump used to praise Portman all the time. Oh, even Rob Portman agrees with me. Here it's
Hmm.
DeWine. Their moderate brand is essentially co opted to make it look like their extremism isn't as bad as it is. So, in some ways, going along for them does more damage than if your everyday far right winger goes along, which is what you'd expect. So, I do think there's a particularly bad place in history because I think their going along provided more momentum than if they had stood up, especially when a guy like Mike DeWine could stand up. He's not running for anything else. He could show some backbone. Almost never has he done so when it really mattered on anything from gerrymandering to that special election in August, which was a clear attack on direct democracy, he always goes along in the end. It's been really tough and frankly sad and sort of pathetic to watch.
Yeah. We had, I would say, our own version of Mike DeWine with our previous governor, Rick Snyder, who came from the corporate world and, for a while was considered to be, a rising star in the Republican Party pre-Trump. And then, of course, the Flint water crisis hit. And, all of his nice moderation kind of fell away when you saw that, cutting government to the bone and not putting people's needs first, putting balance sheets first, means that people actually die sometimes. And,
Yes.
we had that very stark example in Michigan. And, another initiative of his was, he was very pro immigration. Detroit is a city that was shrinking for years. Immigrants that have come in have, started a lot of businesses, helped try and revitalize the area. And he saw that from a business perspective, kind of the Chamber of Commerce perspective pre-Trump. But then, the minute Trump comes on the scene, all of a sudden he starts piping down. It was safe for him to oppose Trump in 2020 when he was out of office. But sure enough, in 2024, he was not one of the Republicans for Harris. And
Right.
he campaigned very hard for Republicans to take back our House. And it's run by a mini Trump. His name is Matt Hall, and he acts like he's the governor. And he even tweets like Trump. And,
Mhm.
this is not a guy in the mold of like Snyder moderation,
Right.
but in the end, the party is more important.
Yeah. No,
And
that's what's
people,
happened here.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I appreciate, hearing what's going on right next door. I know you obviously, wrote about, the issues with Trump and Putin over the weekend.
Yeah.
Trump temporarily got tough. By yesterday, that was gone. Um, you know, uh, he said that he was going to solve everything in Ukraine. That was one of his selling points. Obviously, that hasn't happened, and Putin is great at yanking his chain.
Right.
So, what do you see? What do we have ahead there?
Uh, um, it's so hard to predict. This is I've written about this a few times. I don't know if you know this, but back in my early 20s, I worked in St. Petersburg, Russia, and I actually this is going to sound crazy. I actually interacted with Putin because he was the vice mayor of St. Petersburg.
Wow.
He was the liaison to this is back when we were working with Yeltsin and all that.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'll tell a story about that because it's something that told me everything. So you knew he was a former. About I'm probably one of the only Americans who can say I ever met with him who wasn't doing something really bad. We were trying to do technical assistance. 2 years in to the meetings I had with Putin, you always had an interpreter. I spoke some Russian. He had never spoken a word of English
Hmm,
ever.
wow.
And at some point in one meeting, the interpreter was translating him into English, and she messed up a word he had said, and he corrected her in English. It was good English, and it was a complicated word. Okay.
Ah.
I never forget that moment because
Mhm.
we were actually, quote, working together, and he had never let on that he was listening to everything we were saying.
Ah.
And so ever since that, especially, and I was shocked when he became prime minister. He was just this kind of very serious. A lot of the Russians I met in St. Petersburg at the time were Western minded and actually
Hmm.
charismatic. They were not like Putin. So when he became prime minister, I knew something was not good. But I remember that moment whenever I think about the meetings with him and Trump because he is working Trump over every single time.
Oh yeah.
My guess is every single meeting with Trump, every phone call, especially when Trump goes in unstaffed, doesn't let the interpreter in, it's all on tape.
Right.
It's all essentially compromise. Who know when Trump came out and said, "Oh, we agreed on some new was it Intel service?" Like I can't remember the details now, but so he's working Trump. Oh, Trump is the perfect, what's it called, mark
Hmm.
because I saw it when there was no reason to do it, right? And so I just think that he's got Trump wrapped up in circles. In one way, I'm actually surprised Trump will say anything negative. He never has. But I
Right.
still think in the end, Putin still has him on a chain. They both know it. Uh, and um, and every meeting with Trump, we are at a massive disadvantage. In every meeting, and Trump leaves these meetings always
Mm-hmm.
mimicking and parroting Russian talking points,
Right.
Russian propaganda. Putin gets it into his head, and he walks out of these meetings doing it. So he will always be, I think, the fool. And if
Mm-hmm.
you're Putin, he's perfect. He's like your perfect American president.
Absolutely.
And they can see a guy like that a mile away.
Right.
So it's and that's never going to stop.
Right.
And by the way, if Trump talks a little bit like he is now, and as you said, he promised to stop the war on day one. Obviously, that was ridiculous then. Well, the other thing about his tweets the other day, he's now sort of saying, well, Zelensky's doing something wrong because he's standing up, and Putin is, and it was Biden's fault.
Mm-hmm.
Almost everything happening right now because that Putin is doing this horrible drone strikes that are maybe the worst of the whole war. All of this was enabled by Trump. I mean,
Right.
he's taken away the aid, we've taken away the intel, we're giving Ukraine sanctions and not Russia.
Right.
This was all we're like playing this weird negotiation game where Zelensky shows up and Putin doesn't. All of it is enabling and empowering Putin to do exactly what he's doing. So to now
Right.
play dumb and say, I can't believe he's misbehaving, you invited all of it. Trump invited all of the misbehavior. And so it's exactly what you'd expect from Trump, basically rolling out a red carpet for exactly what's happening today.
Right. And, we know that obviously Mar-a-Lago is just a nest for all sorts of, our foreign adversaries to infiltrate. I mean, we know of a
Yeah.
couple examples of people who've been caught, but who knows how many more have not. And, it's not just Russia, it's around the world.
Yeah.
Um, but, it's no secret that Trump really admires strongmen. That's how he sees himself. That's what this military parade next month is about.
Yeah.
But when you hear him talk, there just seems to be a special feeling that he has for Putin in particular.
Yeah.
I mean, he really has worked him so thoroughly for years, and by what Trump is doing with tariffs, whether he pulls back or not, this destabilization of the economy, weakening the dollar. These are all things that play into Putin's hands.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah.
I think he's jealous of the way that Putin gets to run a country versus
Hmm.
him. The other thing is, and it sort of gets laughed at, and I don't want to overstate this, but we're in Anne Applebaum's written about this incredibly well. We're in a battle of two different views of the world. It's either
Right.
a rule of law, respecting territorial integrity, we treat other countries in a mutually respectful way, or it's pure acquisition, you know, national interest. You just do what you want.
Right.
Putin and China and others and North Korea, they're the one type. We've always been the other type. When
Right.
Trump talks about the Panama Canal and making Canada the 51st state and grabbing Greenland, he's
Hmm.
essentially communicating to the world that the same thing it's literally similar what Putin did with Ukraine. Think about what he says about Canada. Ukraine should be part of Russia. There's a connection there. It's ridiculous that they're not. When Trump talks
Hmm.
about Canada, if you're a Russian hearing that, you're like, oh, the American president thinks about Canada the way our president has approached Ukraine. Everything's fine. So the whole way he communicates about the world, even though we know it's ridiculous, Canada does, as a broader sort of statement about how the world should operate, he sounds just like them. And in those own countries, he's sort of affirming for them, oh yeah, our president is just like the American president. So it's very damaging and sort of the destabilizing the world order. The American
Right.
president has switched from being the guy who would say, like Western Europe, no, you cannot do that in Ukraine. They're a separate country. To have him basically doing the same thing in our hemisphere undermines all of that. I think it's very,
Right.
very dangerous.
Right. And there are many, many critiques that you can make of U.S. foreign policy, and particularly on the left. Those are very valid points to raise. But what we've seen under Trump is that he has completely undermined our soft power. I mean, there is a lot of good that America has done abroad for years with USAID, with funding. All of the scientific research that we've done stopping the spread of AIDS in Africa. And Trump has put an abrupt end to so much good that we have done,
Yeah,
and that helps stop conflicts around the world. And yes,
right,
we have an interest because, sure, sometimes there are military interests, national security interests, business interests for American companies, but nonetheless, I think we can all agree that having less children die of AIDS is a good
right.
goal for anyone to have. And
Hmm.
so these are things that may not hit the headlines every day in America, but it's a way that has really weakened the world. And I feel like really weakened our moral standing.
I
Um,
also think, and this goes back to that time I spent in Russia. I think that the interactions of everyday human beings at that level also kind of it weakens the power of states to get everyone hating each other. It
right.
sounds strange, but I actually really enjoyed my time in Russia. I got to know a number of Russians. I would talk to them about what the former Soviet Union was like. At that time, Russian small businesses would come to my hometown of Cincinnati and they would intern at businesses. And like I think in addition to the direct assistance, I think the human connection you build ends up being something that is some defense to when dictatorial leaders try and get us to all hate each other. And so I think when we lose all that interaction, it's soft power, but it's also real human connection that
Mhm.
in some way makes the world a little safer. And all that gets cut off too. And we're
Right.
seeing this now. Sending international students home, cutting all that off, declaring them the enemy. Like it sends everyone to their corners in their countries, and in many ways that makes even more dangerous these sort of autocratic leaders who try and sort of lock us all out and never knowing other people. So one of my best parts as a younger person was those types of interactions, and it's just sad to see that this intense effort to declare any all these people sort of enemies, make them the
Hmm.
other, have them go home, and then at some point I think the world's a lot more dangerous if that happens again and again and continuously.
Yeah. And then none of this is an accident either.
Right.
Um, the last thing I was just hoping that we could touch on is, the big news yesterday was Elon's going home. He's done with government. He's, spent 100 odd days with Doge doing whatever he did to dismantle everything, and now he's done. Do you buy that, or is this just another distraction?
So I think he probably has not enjoyed his experience. Thank you to those of you who have made clear you don't want to buy Teslas. I think um, you know Citizens United announced that corporate spending is speech. Well, let's make our personal spending our speech. And to the extent that a lot of people said, and by the way, a few years ago we canceled a Tesla order. Like the minute this was before this was when he took over Twitter and started doing crazy things. So my hope is that does send a message. If some company seems to be lifting autocracy,
Hmm.
you don't want to spend your money. You don't want to give them the funds to do that. And so if that was one reason he wants to be less high profile, good job, everyone. On the
Hmm.
flip side, and I don't want to overstate this, but the people I know who are sort of real data security experts have been freaking out from
Yeah.
the day that Doge started that this was never about cost savings.
Right.
It was about rummaging through Social Security and Department of Labor and all the other incredibly rich, valuable, and especially valuable and dangerous in the wrong hands data. And they have been doing that for 100 whatever 100th day we're on. That's not ending. We don't know where
Mhm.
it's gone. Judges have stopped it in some cases, but you could easily see Musk walking out the door saying, I got most of what I came for. And
Right.
now not only do we have an access to it in the public side, but who knows? There have been enough weird stories about it seeming to escape to the private side And once
Mhm.
it's on that side, who knows what other country has? So they clearly didn't save any money. I'm not sure that was the goal.
Mhm.
If it was, they clearly failed. But the much clearer goal, big
Mhm.
picture, it was literally written in the executive order, was about data. And
Right.
I don't have any confidence that that data is not in hands right now, that it should not be in. And Musk leaving doesn't change that. It might even lock it in more on the private side that he has more control over. So I don't feel good at all about the fact that he's leaving, because from the very beginning, one of my most shared Substacks ever was my sort of anonymous interview with someone I know who is a true data expert, whose description of what he thought was happening scared the daylights out of me and everyone who read it. And that was on day one, and it all
Wow.
sort of it all played out as he predicted ever since.
Right. And, so much of Elon Musk's business depends on the Chinese government. And, up until Trump, they were a geopolitical foe in,
Yeah,
for however we treated them. And so, there are real national security risks as well as, not wanting Musk and any of his allies to have this very sensitive data. I mean, none of us like to get those alerts, from, Target. Oh, sorry, your email's been compromised.
yeah,
Now, knowing that much more sensitive data is probably in their hands,
yeah.
I don't feel particularly safe.
No, no, and it's clearly the government's got it, and the government had under certain protocols to keep it safe. But again, people were going into these data sets very early on in ways, again, that I wrote about. I'm not an expert on, that were very insecure, and clearly I think it opened access for non-government players. And once it's out there, I mean, I don't want to sound like Mission Impossible on the knock list, but once it's out there. And I don't trust any private player in the Musk orbit to handle that data in a way that isn't about profit taking or other even worse, motivations. And that's
Right.
all. They had time to do that in a month. They've been
Yes.
there for months. So no, my worry is that this will all play out for a very long time.
Well, I will be continuing to, check pep perspectives to see what's going on with your Save Act on steroids and whatever other madness your legislature and governor cook up. And I look forward to having you over on Lincoln Square next week,
Can I
and we
say
can
one
see
quick
what's
thing?
going on.
Can I say one quick thing? There are a
Absolutely.
few people. Hold on, Ben. Don't go away. There are a few people saying, "Well, what can we do about it?" So I don't want to leave people with only the gloom and doom. Ben, don't go out yet. Um, we have to continue to make as much noise as possible. I worry that some of that is fading. See that Musk left. That's a result of people stepping up and not wanting to spend their money on Teslas, in part. Um, Keep working collectively that way. But here's the other thing: we're in May, folks. The next election that really matters to start sending a signal. Every special election is sending a signal that if we
Yes.
do our job, scares every politician in Washington in what is a very close Congress. That's true this year. That's true next year. So don't just go to the rallies that are out there and celebrate. And I wrote this once a few weeks ago, the fact that there's some famous speaker who may run for president. Use the energy to start recruiting candidates and volunteers to literally go to town this November, next November. Every election can be a mandate that we reject this stuff. And as we've all learned, and again, Karl Rove flipped America in 2010 after Obama was in office and Democrats thought it was over forever. He did it by running hard for state house seats all over, and he flipped states like Ohio, and we've never looked back. So if you want to know what to do about it, Ben and others, start thinking about, is someone running where you are, red or
Mhm.
purple, no more uncontested races, get someone good, and everyone else start helping them. That's how you start sending a signal this year, next year, that we're not just talking about it, but we're all taking our energy and our frustration and using it to take this country back. So that's what we have to do about it. The only way parties out of power have essentially come back is not through dreaming about the next presidential election. It's by
Mhm.
taking things back local and then on up. And there's nothing to stop that from happening right now.
And a lot of us have local elections this year.
Yeah.
There are still a lot of moms for liberty and very conservative
Yes.
candidates that are running for school boards. And, what happens at your kids' schools, they have a lot of influence. And so, you never know because, one day somebody might be on your school board or your township board, and the next they'll be in the state house and beyond. I think having a really good field team for Democrats everywhere, not just in deep blue states, is so important. And so
Absolutely.
there's a lot going on this year. You don't have to wait until 26.
Absolutely. And everything's additive. If people are showing up for school board elections this year, keep right on talking to them through their state house and congressional elections next year. Everyone who shows up local is something to build on if we think about it as a long game to support democracy.
Right. And building those movements, not just in the big areas, the big cities, but
Yes.
your smaller communities is so important, because there are a lot of people who may have voted for Trump and they don't like some of what he's doing. So
Right.
there's an opening now.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I so enjoyed this conversation. I'll look forward to talking with you or, someone else from Lincoln Square next week. And I can't wait to see what else you write. It's one of my favorite things to read every week.
Oh, thanks so much. Take care. Hey, good to see everybody. Talk to
I,
you soon. That's great on the school board races, everybody.